What this is it's the latest attempt by the big content pharmaceutical industry, Disney, content companies in America primarily, to try to expand the reach of intellectual property law to make it stronger, to increase the provisions, the damages for copyright, to reduce the exceptions we have now, to increase patent protection, both in the US and in the world. It's done in a sneaky way by basically putting a 200-page intellectual property chapter buried in this thing called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has a vague, sort of ominous but innocuous, in a way, sounding name, nondescript, I should say. No one really knows what it stands for. It's basically an agreement that has been being negotiated for about 5 years by about 11 or 12 countries. Maybe others will eventually sign on. It's basically a treaty, but it's being done as a trade agreement so that it can be done secretly, because traditionally treaties are negotiated fairly out in the open, like legislation would be debated in the Senate or the Congress with fairly transparent drafts of bills and amendments and things like that. In the past, treaties have been negotiated fairly transparently. Trade agreements have not, because they're usually a one-on-one agreement between two countries. And so those have been done more in secret, like what's called bilateral trade agreements, which America has negotiated dozens of these things over the years. So what they're doing is they're cramming these negotiations, which is really a treaty, into the trade agreement format, which was also done with ACTA, the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, which is also another ominous attempt to put some SOPA-like provisions into the law. The main concern is, well, it's several-fold. Number one, if this thing passes, it's going to be an international obligation of the United States, which means that it ties the hands of Congress. So even if we decided later on we had made a mistake and we wanted to change our patent law or our copyright law to ratchet down some of these provisions, it would probably be a violation of international law to do that. And so then the Congress can say, oh, we can't help it, we're bound. The same thing has happened with the copyright system we have now, which has gotten out of control. When people propose changes to the copyright system, like reducing the term closer to what it was originally, it's called the founder's copyright, then others say, well, we'd like to, but it violates the Berne Convention, which is an international treaty the U.S. foisted upon the world and itself decades ago. So one problem with doing it by treaty is that we obligate ourselves under international law to have certain minimum standards of IP protection, which are higher than what we have now and what other countries have now, in addition to the substantive problems with the law that it would require us to enact, and in addition to the fact. So practically what it would do, several things potentially. Now, these negotiations are secret, so we don't know everything. All we have is a leak from WikiLeaks a couple of months ago for the IP chapter. Now, this is one chapter out of 30 or 40-something chapters, only 5 of which have to do with trade. Okay, so this is not really a free trade agreement. It's really an excuse. It's a Trojan horse to get IP protections exported to the rest of the world and to increase even U.S. IP protections, or to make us more unable to lower IP standards in the future. So this is really at the behest of the corporate lobbyists. I think there's, in the U.S. trade negotiation structure of the federal government, it's closed doors. Even Congress doesn't have full access to it, and there's basically 600 corporate lobbyists who have access behind the doors. So basically you have corporate lobbyists for corporate interests in America, which are writing these laws, which they then get the government to pass on their behalf. And this is done under the name of free trade, which is obscene, because it would actually increase patent monopoly protection. It would increase copyright monopoly protection. It would increase consumer prices for pharmaceuticals. It would make it harder to have generics. It would probably choke back on the small safe harbor we have now from the DMCA provision. It would probably choke back on the small, brief window of freedom we have right now to unlock our own devices, even when it's not copyright infringement. So it would probably have all kinds of deleterious effects, like manga. There's a whole manga art in Japan that could be affected because there's this sort of fan art culture there. The effects are numerous. It could reduce free trade because you'd be less able to re-import patented drugs overseas. It would increase Medicare and other government medical expenses because they would be unable to buy generic drugs as easily. They would have to get patented version, which is much more expensive. It would be easier to extend the pharmaceutical patent idea by just claiming, like, say the drug works for 12 hours, and then we come up with a new version that works for 24 hours. Now that patent can be extended. Go ahead. Absolutely. That is related to the point I made about the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright provision, which is a way that you can send a takedown notice to YouTube, and they have to comply. But as long as they comply according to a certain series of procedural steps that are laid out in this procedure, then they're immune from liability for what their users do. That is called a safe harbor. It was put into the law in the late 90s, I think by accident in a sense, because the internet was just starting, and I don't think the content providers knew what they were agreeing to there. Luckily, they did. If they hadn't done that, maybe YouTube wouldn't exist. The entire internet model that we know now wouldn't exist. And ever since this procedure has been available, copyright advocates have been fighting Hollywood, the music industry. They've been fighting tooth and nail to get that safe harbor shut down. And what that would do is that would make the ISPs like YouTube or Google or your local ISP be a policeman, because they have to start policing content, because if they don't, if they make a mistake, they're going to be potentially liable for the acts of their users, defamation or copyright infringement or whatever, which basically means they would just shut down everything because they want to be risk averse. So what these guys are trying to do is undo the DMCA safe harbor provision through the back door, through this Trojan horse in the TPP, and also in other things like SOPA would have done that. ACTA's got some stuff along these lines as well. So it's extremely dangerous for internet freedom. I think the thing we need to look out for right now is there is an attempt as we speak by the evil Orrin Hatch and these pro-Republic, these pro-IP congressmen who are always on the side of the big content and big pharma and Monsanto and these types of companies that want agricultural patents and gene patents. There's an attempt I think just 2 days ago, Orrin Hatch introduced a fast-track negotiating authority bill, which would strip Congress of its supervisory authority and give Obama, so this is weird, right? You have Republicans trying to give Obama unilateral authority to negotiate and conclude these agreements on his own. In other words, it could be part of U.S. law and international law only on the executive branch's say so. That's what fast track authority does, which is an anomalous thing that Richard Nixon invented in the 70s. But so we have to stop fast track, number one, and I think the bill could be in trouble. There's a lot of nervousness about it, but on the other hand, there's those 600 lobbyists behind the scenes, and lots of money being pumped into the coffers of various congressmen and also lobbying groups. I mean, even Cato, which is libertarian, has had 2 different speakers or articles or conferences promoting the TPP because it's free trade, even though they acknowledge that we don't know what the free trade part is. The free trade chapter is only 5 chapters out of 30. And the big 200-page chapter is on intellectual property, and they even acknowledge that that's problematic, and yet they're still in favor of fast-track authority and the TPP itself. So it's just it's frightening the power that these lobbyists and these special interests have. The only hope is that something like the SOPA uprising will happen, right? The thing that killed SOPA about 1.5 years ago. But right after SOPA was killed, I think the next day, ACTA was signed. Obama just went ahead and signed it. So right now, the status of ACTA is not even clear. Japan has ratified it. U.S. has signed it, but we haven't ratified it. But the Obama administration acts like we don't need to have it signed because it's a so-called executive hyphen congressional agreement, whatever that is. So they pretend to bind U.S. to certain standards of copyright just on the say-so of the executive branch. So one thing we have to fight is fast-track authority. Then we have to fight the Senate ratifying this so-called trade agreement. There's a good site, by the way, called there's a good website. Let me give you one website people can go to. It's expose. I think it's called exposethetpp.org, and it's got a lot of good information on the law or on the treaty, and steps you can take to try to fight it. Exposethetpp.org. I think they do. I couldn't find it from a quick search this morning. Probably EFF.org has something on it, but exposethetpp.org, which is, by the way, ironically, this is a site done by sort of these democracy, fair trade types, which normally wouldn't be the closest allies of libertarians. But if you listen to their arguments, they're much more libertarian than, say, the Cato supposedly free trade arguments. Well, I think that people need to know that even if TPP goes down in flames, like SOPA went down in flames and PIPA before it, first beware of acronyms. There's a lot of acronyms the government uses to sort of hide the nature of these things. I've got a blog post on my site, c4sif.org. It's called Death by Copyright IP Fascist Police State Acronym. I just collected all the acronyms the government has used for IP related things over the years. And I just omitted the ones that don't have an acronym, like the patent law, that's just the Patent Act, or the Lanham Act, which is trademark, because that's not an acronym. I just looked at the acronym. You have things like ICE, Immigration and Custom Enforcement. You have the Patriot Act. You have WIPO, GATT, PCT, the Patent Cooperation Treaty. And in recent years, you had attempts at legislation like ACTA, SOPA, PIPA, COICA, the PCIP, Protecting Children from Internet Pornographers Act. CISPA, the ITU, CETA. So these acronyms are going to keep coming. TPP is the latest. Even if we defeat it, expect these guys to rear their heads either in domestic legislation, either under the guise of free trade or the guise of stopping piracy or the guise of protecting children from pornography or the guise of stopping gambling or money laundering or terrorism. Government uses all these things as a way to cover what they're really doing, which is trying to clamp down on our freedom and impose monopoly prices on us at the behest of the big media and content companies and the pharmaceutical industry in the U.S. So I think we need to just stop thinking of this as free trade or property rights. It's basically a monopoly, special interest, rent-seeking grab by large corporations who are in bed with this huge state, and we just have to be aware that it's dangerous and it's not the free market. The free market stance is to oppose these monopolies and especially to oppose the extension of these monopoly systems. I'm the executive editor of Libertarian Papers, but a lot of the stuff on libertarianism and free markets and intellectual property and the intersection of all that is at my site c4sif.org, which is Center for the Study of Innovative Freedom. Thank you very much.